Thanks so much for joining us, Lee. I've had the privilege of reading the book, not in its physical form, because what a monster this is, but on proofs. And it's a monumental achievement. It is the definitive making of The Shining. And everyone here who's obsessed with The Shining will learn a whole load in this book they did not know before. But let's go right back to the start with you. You mention in your preface when you first saw it and how the obsession took hold with you. Could you give them a flavor of that?
Sure, absolutely. I apologize for my voice in advance. I've been very sick the last few days. I first saw The Shining when I was 12 years old. My mom took me to see it in theaters when it came out in 1980. And it just kind of wormed its way into my psyche almost immediately. I wish I could remember more about seeing it that first time than I do, but I know that it just really stuck with me. And a few days later, I got a copy of the paperback of the movie tie-in edition of Stephen King's novel. And in the middle of that book were a bunch of black and white stills from the movie. And at some point, I realized that one of the stills, which was an image of Shelley Duvall cooking in the kitchen, I realized that that was a shot that is not in the movie. And that started to kind of bother me because I thought, wow, if there's a scene that was shot that's not in the film, were there others? And that led me kind of through my teenage years into trying to do whatever I could to get my hands on a screenplay for the film. But unfortunately, Stanley kept very close grips on all of that stuff. And the only thing that was out in the world was a post-production screenplay, which was basically a transcription of the finished cut film. So it was many, many years before I got to get a glimpse behind the curtains. That didn't happen until after I finished Toy Story 3, when I went and visited the Kubrick Archive for the first time.
This is not a shot from Toy Story 3. Amazingly, Toy Story 1 features the carpet from The Shining, which was a coincidence.
It had nothing to do with me. A lot of people assume that it's in the movie because of me, but that was actually due to production designer Ralph Eggleston on the film. I am responsible for many more Shining Easter eggs in later films.
Of course. Imagine then, given your own discovery about this unused footage, what any British viewer of The Shining had to find out. Because as we'll mention later, there are two alternate versions, and the British version, which Stanley Kubrick cut, is about 25 minutes shorter than the American release. So for anyone who discovered The Shining in the 80s or 90s in the UK, there was this whole world of other extra Shining to be explored, which was kind of insane for the likes of me, tracking that stuff down on VHS.
Well, it's very strange to think that there are two versions of the movie out in the world simultaneously. I asked Leon Vitali, who sadly passed away just a few months ago, why, after Stanley did the cut-down version, why did that not become the definitive version? And he said that Stanley's philosophy was that whatever version was released in a particular territory, that should forever be the definitive version of the film. So he was fine with there being two versions out in the world.
One of the deleted scenes, even in the US cut, is this scene of Jack Torrance reading through the scrapbook, which tells him all about the Overlook's history. I think to the chagrin of the screenwriter Diane Johnson, she always felt this scene should have stayed in there. But essentially that's this book.
Well, so anyone who's read Stephen King's novel knows that this scrapbook is kind of a central part of the story, and it was a central part of the film. Stanley shot many scenes that involved the scrapbook and Jack's fascination with it. In fact, the film was meant to end with a camera move into the party photo with Jack in it in the scrapbook. That was his intention. And I think he decided to excise everything with the scrapbook while he was still in production. That seems to be the case. But in any account, he wasn't able to shoot that because that whole stage burned down. It burned down after Jack Nicholson had wrapped off the film. So Stanley, he didn't have the set to shoot that shot, and so he reconceived it to be the long, slow track-in on the photo on the wall.
Yeah, this was notorious fire of the Colorado Lounge set, which for the production's benefit happened right at the end. I mean, it didn't ruin any scenes, but it did cause...
It's my understanding that the only thing that Stanley had left to shoot was that shot.
Scene, yeah. It caused a lot of problems for Empire Strikes Back, which was supposed to be shooting in that set, basically, a couple of weeks later. Let's delve into the book and show you some of the stuff inside. This is one of the the volumes, the contents of one of the volumes? The
We have,
ephemera?
so anyway, this book that you see here is, we call it the scrapbook, and it was inspired by the scrapbook in the movie. And we had a lot of fun putting this together. It's ostensibly a kind of a photo folio, one photo per page, very beautiful. And then there's a making of book, which is the smaller one you see here with the red edges. And then there's a box of typing paper, and within that is a bunch of ephemera. There's a continuity script, that's the one with the orange cover. That was a script that was given to me by Stanley's daughter, Vivian, that was gifted to her by June Randall, who is the script supervisor. And when it showed up in the mail, I just about died because it was just fascinating. It was filled with production Polaroids, continuity Polaroids that were one-of-a-kind photos. Anyway, lots of great stuff in that script, including little tidbits of Stanley's own writings on the stage in the moment, because they would often rehearse and come up with new dialogue, and Stanley would sit and type those bits out, and then those would end up getting taped into the script. So we created a complete facsimile of that continuity script, and that's included with the set.
Gotcha. Here's one of the bits of trivia that everyone loves to talk about with The Shining. Room 237. Here it is, some footage from that legendary scene in the bathroom. In the novel, as many people will know, it's room 217. Do you want to explain why the change? And I'll cue up the
Well, the hotel in the movie, I mean, it's inspired by multiple things. There was the Stanley Hotel in Colorado, which is the hotel that Stephen King stayed at that inspired him to write the novel. And then the exterior of the Overlook Hotel was greatly inspired by the Timberline Lodge, which is in Oregon on Mount Hood. And then the interior, much of the interiors being like the Colorado Lounge and the lobby, the look of the elevators, all of that came from a hotel in Yosemite National Park, which used to be called the Ahwahnee. It's been renamed now, and I don't remember what the name is now. But it's very uncanny if you're ever on a trip to the States and find yourself in Yosemite. When you walk in, it's not like an exact duplicate of The Shining, but you feel like you're in The Shining. It's very strange.
And the story with the hotel is that the Timberline Lodge, this is the actual letter in which the Timberline Lodge begged Kubrick not to make it room 217 because they thought that no one would ever go back.
Well, they had a room 217, and they thought no one would want to stay there. So they asked him to change it, and interestingly, you can see Stanley's response scribbled at the bottom of the letter saying, let them know we've changed it to 237.
It's unusually obliging for Kubrick, don't you think? A man who famously said no to a lot of people in his life.
Well, I don't know. I mean, this sounds pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's very reasonable.
It didn't really matter. And in fact, for the people that get into all the odd numerology in The Shining, 237 fits right into it. So there's probably a reason he picked that number. If you go back one slide, I just want to say one thing.
Yeah.
The woman who is in the bathtub in room 237 she's not an actress. She was a woman named Billy Gibson. And as I heard the story, she was a patient of Stanley's dentist. And they found her because they were looking for an older woman who wore dentures because they wanted somebody who could take her teeth out as part of being in this makeup and playing this part. So by all accounts, she was a very sweet woman, but she never acted before or after The Shining.
Yeah, we've got a couple of more slides of her in a second, which are a special treat, I must say. Production and famously the long takes. Let's talk about the sort of apocryphal notion that Kubrick took 150 takes of the kitchen scene with Scatman Crothers, or 112 takes of the scene on the stairs. What did you find out about those scenes?
Well, what I've learned over the years doing research about The Shining is that there are a lot of apocryphal stories about the making of The Shining that are either simply not true or they're greatly exaggerated. And I see them get more and more exaggerated as the years go by. And one of them has to do with the number of takes that Stanley shot. Now, there were some times that he did do a lot of takes, certainly, but they were almost always instances where the actors didn't know their lines quite well enough, and that usually had to do with Scatman Crothers, who played Dick Halloran. The scene in the kitchen where he's talking to Danny, there were quite a few takes on that scene because of that. But the scene that actually had the most takes, and I never see it listed correctly, was the scene where the family is being showed the gold ballroom at the beginning of the film when they're being given the tour. That was the one that, because I have all the production records and I see how many takes, and I know kind of what happened throughout the film, and that was actually the shot that had the highest number of takes.
Quite a few of your interviews in the book, when they talk about this aspect of production, and it did take 3 times longer than Warner Brothers had sort of counted on. A lot of the crew sort of seems to say, well, Stanley always knew exactly what he didn't want, but you had to kind of work through a lot to get to a point where he showed him what he wanted.
I mean, again, and I'm being hesitant tonight because I know that there's some people here who actually worked on The Shining, and I feel strange sometimes speaking for the film, but all I can speak to is what people have told me and all the research that I've done over the years. By all accounts, Stanley, you know, he had a certain way of working. He wanted to work that way, and he structured his productions and his crew size so that he could take the time to make his films and not have them go crazily over budget, right? So The Shining had a really very small crew, and there were some times that there were only, you know, a large handful of people on the set while he was shooting. And again, he did that because he wanted to work at the pace he wanted to work. I mean, it certainly wasn't efficient. They had taken over pretty much all the stages at Elstree, and there were times that they would just jump around from stage to stage on Stanley's whim, according to what he wanted to shoot on any given day. So that's typically not how film production goes, but that's how Stanley wanted to work, and so, you know, he was accommodated.
And they also talk about this feeling of family that he engendered in his crews and keeping it tight like that, which I suppose would have been especially helpful on this film because of the children involved in the cast. Not only Danny Lloyd, but also the twins we have here. You've met the twins. Mm-hmm. You've interviewed the twins for the book. Tell us about them.
They're great. They're very interesting women. They're about this tall still. And they speak very quickly, and they complete each other's sentences. They're very proud of having worked on The Shining. Yes, they got doused in blood in the hallway. I think they thought it was a lot of fun at the time. They didn't take any of it seriously. Stanley was very concerned about them being scared or, you know, being traumatized in any way, but they weren't. Even in the moment, they just thought it was a bit of good fun, I think. I want to say something because I haven't said it. A lot of these photos that you're seeing came from, I got to know Dan Lloyd, who played young Danny in the film, and he eventually introduced me to his parents, Jim and Ann, who were with him through the whole production. And I spent a lot of time getting to know them, and they eventually brought up a trunk from their basement that was filled with costumes from the film and about 450 35 millimeter negatives that Dan's father, Jim, had shot on the set that had not been seen by anybody outside the family, ever. And I was completely gobsmacked, of course, when I started going through them. And they ultimately gave them all to me so that I could scan them, and I used quite a few of them in the book. And they're really great not only to see, but they helped me fill in a lot of gaps because they photographed aspects of the production that weren't covered otherwise. Murray, do you mind if I mention that you're here? It's too late now, right? Murray Close is here, who worked on the film, and he took a lot of still photographs in addition to his other work on the film. And there were some scenes on the film, like the big ballroom scene and the scene outside in the maze when Danny and Wendy are walking around. There were several scenes that were very well covered photographically, but then there were vast swaths of the film that didn't have any photographs. And so I initially wasn't sure I had enough material to do a book. And it wasn't until I found this treasure trove of photographs from the Lloyd family and other photographs that I ended up getting from other crew members who had them squirreled away that I finally realized I had enough to put together a TASCHEN book.
Including stuff presumably like this, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, this is an amazing photo, and this is this is one of the very last photos that I found when I went to the Kubrick Archive near the end of the process to scan all of, in high res, all of the negatives that they had. As I was setting up, one of the archivists said, you know, we just got 2 boxes from Chittickbury, from Stanley's estate, that were labeled The Shining, and we haven't had a chance to look at them yet. We haven't archived them, cataloged them, but if you're interested, you're welcome to take a look. Well, of course, I wanted to take a look and open them up, and there were just some amazing things inside, including this, and there are a few other photographs from this moment that are just stunning. And nobody, you're seeing them now, but only a handful of people have ever seen these photographs ever, but they are in the book.
Yeah, I kind of jumped out of my seat when I was just on my laptop the other night and that came up. It was, it's quite extraordinary. We'll talk a little bit about Shelley Duvall. This is a letter in Shelley Duvall's incredibly beautiful handwriting in which she writes to Stanley talking about her ideas for her costume.
Shelley was cast in the film. She had just won Best Actress at Cannes for 3 Women. And she had gotten the phone call telling her she had won. And right after she hung up the phone, she told me that the phone rang a second time, and it was her manager telling her that Stanley wanted to cast her in his next film with Jack Nicholson. So she was cast, she was very excited, but it turned out to be a long time before Stanley actually was ready to bring her over. It kept getting extended and extended. And in that period of time, at some point, Shelley wrote Stanley this letter, which is basically offering to bring some of her own clothes over to be wardrobe, and her own ideas about what the character of Wendy might wear. So I thought that was a really neat find that was in the Kubrick Archive.
There's some really lovely imagery of Shelley throughout the book.
The other thing that I found when I was going through the archive's materials, a lot of the photographs were shot by Murray and by Jan Harlan, but I found two roles that the archive didn't even, they weren't even aware, but I finally realized that they were shot by Stanley. They were labeled SK, and when I went through them, this may be just me projecting onto it, but I really felt like I could feel the fact that they were Stanley's photographs. And this is, that last one was one of them, of Shelley and Jack on the bed. Mm-hmm.
And so in that role, I think Warner Brothers have been looking at people like Jane Fonda and maybe Jessica Lange. They were in the mix.
Well, no, I mean, the studio wasn't looking at them. It was Stanley was trying to figure out who he wanted. I don't think Jessica Lange was ever in the mix. Jack Nicholson wanted Jessica Lange to be in the mix, because she was a beautiful young actress who was newly on the scene, and he did get to work with her 2 movies later on The Postman Always Rings Twice. Mm-hmm. Everyone was a bit surprised when Stanley said that he was casting Shelley. They didn't quite understand it, but she's brilliant, and I can't imagine someone like Jane Fonda playing this part.
I agree. I mean, anyone who's a big Shining fan just could not imagine anyone but Shelley in that role. She is just quite extraordinary.
Shelley told me that Stanley hired her in part because he liked how convincingly she cried in 3 Women.
Right, there we go. And there is one quote from the book from Kubrick, which I can't resist quoting, because it's a bit devilish, but it does sort of it captures something about what it is about Shelley Duvall's casting that kind of works. He was sort of explaining why he cast her on set, and he said, you've got to have somebody in that part that maybe the audience would also like to kill a little bit, which is kind of Stanley at his most devilish and cheeky. But there's something there. I mean, his daughter Vivian, who was, 18?
She was 17. She turned 18 during the film.
Made a very well-known kind of making-of video at the time called Making the Shining, which is 40 minutes long. It's always on the Blu-ray editions and so on. And it does culminate towards the end with one scene where Stanley gets rough with Shelley, he gets impatient with her, the snow machine is working and the crew are waiting for her, and he snaps at her. And I think possibly because of that, there's always been this sort of legend out there.
Well, that's another one of these stories that's just been more and more exaggerated over the years. Exactly, yeah. That scene was shot very near the end of production, so everyone was likely a bit crispy and exhausted. And Vivian happened to be there with her camera when that was shot. But Stanley chose to put that in Vivian's film. I mean, he had final say over Vivian's film. And I think Stanley probably, I'm just guessing, felt that it showed him being a little, authoritative and being in control. But unfortunately, people have taken that moment and extrapolated out that must have been Shelley's entire experience on the film, which is simply not the case. And when I talk about this, I like to put the power, the final word on that matter with just one person, and that's Shelley. Shelley gave an extensive interview when she finished the production, which I got my hands on. And I also spent time with Shelley, talking to her, and just recently she gave an interview for The Hollywood Reporter. And in every case, when she's asked about whether Stanley mistreated her in any way, she vehemently denies it. She says she only has warm memories of Stanley. She says the role was very difficult, and that Stanley's methods maybe weren't in alignment with, how she might have thought what she needed to get to the end result. But she doesn't argue with the performance. She loves the performance, and even though it was a very difficult role, it was grueling. She had to spend, probably the last several months of production having to work herself up into a state of hysteria day in and day out. And it couldn't have been easy.
Of course, yeah. And indeed, in Vivian's film, there was in the original cut, there was a sequence of him being so sweet and lovely with her, which Kubrick just didn't want in there. So he sort of he took that out.
I hesitate to
Sure.
be an authority on this at all, but by all accounts, Stanley was mostly a very sweet man, and maybe a bit introverted. a big thinker, and I think he was well aware of his image out in the world. And he never really did a whole lot to kind of change that image. I think he probably liked that people thought of him that way, as being kind of up on a pedestal and being this kind of powerful figure. And I can only imagine that when he was reviewing Vivian's cut of the film, he gravitated towards those moments where he seemed to be kind of strong and in control, and not indecisive, which he was often during the filming of The Shining and other films, from what I've been told. I mean, Stanley, a lot of people like to think that Stanley Kubrick just birthed these films into the world, fully realized, but you know, he often didn't know what he wanted. He was often searching for something elusive, something interesting. He was well into production on The Shining before he even knew how he was going to end the film. Scatman Crothers shot all of his scenes from the beginning of the film, and then he went back to America thinking that when he came back, he was going to shoot the scenes where he came back and rescued Wendy and Danny. But he came back to England only to discover that Stanley had decided to have Jack kill him. So that was a decision that came late in the game, and there were many other decisions having to do with the ending and the chase in the maze that he only came to late in the process.
It does feel like the making of the film was sort of like a wandering through a maze, and there were dead ends, and there were a lot of decisions that got taken back, and the ending was always a problem.
And I've heard the same thing about Full Metal Jacket, that he was very indecisive about how he wanted to end the film based on Matthew Modine's diaries that he kept.
People who've read the book will know that the ending is vastly different in the book, with the burning down of the Overlook, and Kubrick almost went in the other direction. Instead of it becoming an inferno, he ends with a frozen maze. You know, it's sort of almost...
Right, which Stephen King hates, as well as a lot of other things about the film. But, I mean, early in the writing process, when he was working with Diane Johnson, who was a novelist, she hadn't been a screenwriter at all, they even kicked around ideas that involved Jack killing Wendy and Danny. And the whole family being dead, and then the new caretaker showing up the next year, being toured around the Overlook, and we see the ghosts of Wendy and Jack and Danny sitting in the Overlook. So he went down a lot of alleys just trying to explore and figure out what might be interesting for his film.
And there was the variant with Halloran being possessed by the ghost of the hotel and becoming the killer.
Yeah, there was a version where Halloran, where we see him making his way back to the hotel, and we're investing everything in him being the knight in shining armor that's going to rescue everyone, only to have him show up and be the one who then is going to finish the job that Jack couldn't. So he really was just trying to find ways to surprise the audience and do something interesting.
Let's talk a little bit about the predominant piece of camera technology that will always be associated with The Shining, perhaps more than any camera technology in any other film gets associated, and that's the Steadicam, which was a very fresh piece of equipment. It had been used in maybe 3 films until this, right?
Yeah, the Steadicam's a piece of equipment, for people who don't know, that allows the camera operator to produce very smooth moving camera moves that don't feel handheld. You can walk up and down stairs, you can do any number of things, and you still get a perfectly smooth image. I mean, it's a standard piece of filmmaking equipment now. But at the time, it was invented by a guy named Garrett Brown, and Garrett had only used it on 2 other films before The Shining. He used it for a shot on Paths of Glory. Sorry, not Paths of Glory.
It was Bound for Glory.
Bound for Glory, thank you. It's my cold medicine. And he also used it on Rocky for the scene of Stallone running up the stairs. Stanley was shown a demo reel of the Steadicam and was like really, really intrigued. He met with Garrett and knew that he really wanted to make use of this on his film. And so they ended up designing a lot of sets, including the maze, knowing that they were going to be able to use the Steadicam because there really would have been no other way to shoot those scenes. So the sets became sets that, you know, were all in alignment with each other on these sound stages. You could move from one set to the next seamlessly, and Stanley took full advantage of the Steadicam by, you know, designing them the way that he did. Garrett didn't think he was going to be operating on the film initially, but the more time he spent with Stanley, he realized that this was going to be an amazing opportunity for him and an amazing showcase for his invention. But first and foremost, an opportunity to work for Stanley Kubrick, which was, you know, an amazing opportunity. And he ended up operating most of the Steadicam, but not all the Steadicam on the film.
One of the days of shooting up and down the corridors with Danny was attended by Werner Herzog, and I want you to explain what he noticed about the sound in that sequence that has ended up being part of the film.
Yeah, I'll back up just slightly because it's an interesting story. I'd accumulated all these hundreds and hundreds of photos, And I was sitting with, one of the photos was of Danny and his older brother on the back lot at Elstree. And there was a guy in the background with kind of an afro a bit and a big heavy mustache. And I never knew who he was. He didn't seem to be a crew member because I had gotten to know who all the crew members were at that point. I was sitting with Leon Vitali and showing him my collection of photos, which I often did with people I was interviewing in person because stories would come out of them seeing the photos. And when I hit that photo, Leon said, "Oh, that's Werner Herzog." And I had no idea because it looked, he's like, I don't know, he's in his mid-30s probably at the time. And it turns out that Werner Herzog was on the set because he was meeting with Jack Nicholson about potentially doing a project. And the day that he was on the set was the day that they were shooting the Steadicam following Danny around through the hotel, riding his three-wheeler. And as the story was told to me by a few different people, as they were shooting it, Stanley, actually it was the sound guy, Ivan Sharak, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, was concerned about the sound. He was concerned about this alternating carpet, and then the floors were really noisy, and Stanley was concerned, and he had a take played back for him on his cans, and he said, yeah, that might be a problem. And it was Werner Herzog who said, actually, I think it sounds kind of cool. And Stanley listened to it again and said, well, maybe you're right. And then it was when they were actually watching the footage played back in dailies that Stanley realized how amazing it was. So I thought it was a cool story, not only because Werner Herzog's involved, but also it's just exemplative of the fact that Stanley, that wasn't something that he dreamt up and created. It was something he discovered accidentally on the set, but had the taste to know that it was something really interesting.
It was one of those happy accidents, and I think this sequence here features a sort of happy accident, despite being the goriest moment in the film. You've already mentioned how they settled on this ending, but tell us a bit about the axe that was used specially and what Jack Nicholson did with it that day.
So they tried a few different ways of executing this stunt with Scatman Crothers doing the axe going into him, and what they finally settled on was they built a fiberglass shell with a metal plate behind it that was molded to Scatman's body, and then there was a bunch of padding on top of that, which you see in this photo strapped onto Scatman. And then they made a special axe that had the sharp edge of the axe, that whole half of that axe head cut off, and then there were these two little spikes that were hollow. And those spikes were connected to tubing that ran down through the axe handle. And then there was somebody off stage with a kind of an air cannon that could shoot the blood. And Jack would come out and he would swing that axe right into Scatman. And at that same moment, the blood would be fired. So you get this feeling of kind of like blood bursting out when it hit him. As the story was told to me, when they were shooting, Scatman went down, and then Jack decided to hit him a second time with the axe, and they ended up shooting more coverage of that. But ultimately, not until they were in the editing room, Stanley decided it was just too much. He had actually cut it, but then the next morning had second thoughts and said, let's just go back to the one hit. Yeah.
We're nearing the end. You will be watching the extended version of The Shining very soon. We touched on that at the beginning, but there's a version that's even slightly longer, isn't there? Which was the very first US premiere version, including a hospital scene. Talked about why that didn't make the cut that we now have before us.
Well, for people who don't know, originally, as intended, the film cut to Jack dead, frozen in the snow, and here you can see him kind of in his rig that was meant to hold his head rock steady. After this shot, there was a whole epilogue in a hospital where Stuart Ullman, who's the hotel manager we meet during Jack's interview, he shows up to see Shelley in the hospital, and Danny's playing out by the nurse's station. And he basically tells Wendy, the character of Wendy, that they didn't find anything at the hotel. And he basically kind of gaslights her. And then he leaves. He offers a chance for Wendy and Danny to come stay at his place in Los Angeles. And then he leaves, says goodbye to Danny. He's on his way out, and at the last moment he turns back and says, hey, Danny. And he tosses him a tennis ball, which is the tennis ball motif that we see throughout the film. And I guess it was meant to be kind of a mysterious, the power of the hotel is still there, and who is a part of it? Is the manager a part of it? And as I was told, the scene was in and out of the film. Stanley wasn't sure if it should be there. Many times it came in and out, and at the very end, I was told that it was Vivian who convinced him to put it in, and he did. And it was only after it had been released in Los Angeles and New York that Stanley decided it needed to come out, and so he sent an editor in each city to travel around to all the theaters and actually physically cut it out of the prints.
Yeah. Which the sound team were not best pleased with because it disrupted one of their fluent transitions.
Well, he was cutting an optical track
Yeah.
on the film, and that's never a good idea. I will say, we don't have an image to show you tonight, but you know, that scene, that hospital scene, has long been thought completely gone. And the only remnants that have ever been out in the world are a handful of black and white production continuity Polaroids that exist. A few of them are in the Stanley Kubrick's archive book, Stanley Kubrick Archives book, and there are more that are in the actual archive. And I've included some of those, but I actually did find some images from the scene that are in the book, which was always kind of a holy grail for me, and it's very exciting to be sharing those.
Veiling them, yeah.
Yeah.
Just as a closing discussion point, the confusion around those different versions, I suppose, at the time was part of a general confusion about the film, perhaps. The reviews seem a bit bewildered. It didn't get that much critical.
Most of the reviews were terrible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
There were very few good reviews at the time.
So why has it taken, in your view, so long for the film to be enshrined now and to crack the top 100 for the first time, for example, of the BFI's?
Yeah, I just saw that.
Yes. Why has it taken so long?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you look at any of Stanley's films, when they opened, people were often befuddled by them, and they often got bad reviews. And I think Stanley had gotten kind of used to that. Not that he liked it. You know, nobody wants to get bad reviews, but he was certainly used to it. I don't know. Stanley's films have a way of, you know, they reveal themselves over time and across repeat viewings. I interviewed Steven Spielberg for the book, and he actually kindly wrote the foreword for the book. And he himself did not like The Shining when he first saw it. And he actually spent time with Stanley, and Stanley kind of grilled him about what he didn't like about it. And all those stories are in the book, which are really interesting. But for Steven, you know, over time, as with many of us, although I loved it from the beginning, it revealed itself to him, and he grew to appreciate it over time, to the point where he actually paid homage to it in his film Ready Player One.
Exactly, and there's a lot of that going on. Anyone who's seen Dr. Sleep has seen the Overlook recreated, and in a strange fusion of Kubrick's vision and Stephen King's vision. Perhaps Stephen King will never come round to the Kubrick version of his story, perhaps.
I don't think he will.
But the rest of us think it's pretty much a masterpiece, I would say. And your book really is almost the cornerstone, I feel now, of the cult of The Shining.
Well, I wanted to create the definitive book on the making of the film because there's been loads written about analyzing the film and all its hidden meanings and, you know, conspiracy theories about the film, but I had read very little about the actual making. And so 10 years ago, I started the process of diving in and tracking down every last person who was still living, who acted in the film or worked on the film, down to prop men and painters, and spoke with all of them. And what emerged from that, with the partnership, I need to say, of a great writer, J.W. Rinsler, Jonathan Rinsler, who had written a number of making-of books, very acclaimed making-of books about the Star Wars films and Indiana Jones. I hired Jonathan to write the text for this book, and we worked very closely for a number of years crafting it. He sadly got pancreatic cancer as he was finishing writing the book, and he was only given maybe 2 to 3 months to live. He ended up living a year, but it wasn't long enough to see the book come out. So I'm very sad that he is not seeing this, because he was very, very proud. I mean, it was a capstone to his career to be writing about a Kubrick film. But I have dedicated the book to him, and hopefully he's here in spirit.
And I do think what you've put together is essentially all The Shining that is fit to print, and will stand in that regard for a long, long time now. Thank you so much to Lee for joining us. I hope you all enjoy this extended version you're about to see, but please do join me in thanking him for his time.
Thank you.
Cool.